I have a Minolta MC Rokkor-PF 58mm f1.4 lens here that I'm going to be disassembling. I've already disassembled one copy of the lens, but that was the MC2 version, and this is the MC1. The easiest way, here I'm going to bring in the MC2 version, the easiest way to tell the two apart is that the MC1 version here, the ridges on the focusing ring here are not indented, where on the MC2 you can see that they kind of go in a little bit to provide a slightly better grip. So if you're looking at them from above, the MC1 just has a smooth outer circumference, the MC2 has kind of this wavy circumference on the edge. But internally they're assembled very similarly, and the optics and all the layout of the lens internally is very similar between the two. It's really just cosmetically, and then some of the some small internal differences as well. I'm going to be fully taking apart this lens, getting access to the diaphragm, and also taking apart the diaphragm itself and cleaning it. You can see that on this copy of the lens here, if I go in and adjust it, it works, but it's a little bit slow. So it's something, there seems to be a little bit of oil on the diaphragm there, so cleaning that off should improve that. So first off here, go in and get access to the back of the diaphragm. This is pretty easy to do. Just on the back of the lens here, you can see that the back optic right here, there are two little divots on the outermost black ring on either side that you can use a spanning wrench on, and this will remove the entire back optic and get us access to the back of the diaphragm as well. Alright, so there's the back optic. This can be further disassembled as well. There are two little divots on both the front section here, on this little ring on the inside, and on the back section that you can use to further disassemble this back optic if there's anything inside there. But in this case, I'll just set that aside. Now we have access to the back of the diaphragm. In this case, you can actually see the oil, kind of if I adjust it here, you can see the little darker sections. That's actually the oil in there. It's not enough to actually prevent this from operating, but it definitely does slow it down. It should be snapping back much quicker than it does currently. And if there's just a tiny bit of oil on your lens, you can probably try to clean it in this current state, but it's very easy to get access to both sides of the diaphragm and actually remove the diaphragm completely, which is what I'm going to be doing now. So looking here at the front of the lens, we have the name ring going around here on the front section, and it also has two little divots on either side for a spanning wrench. So go in there and remove the name ring first. Alright, so there's the name ring. And now you can see down into the lens we have this black ring on the top, which is what the filters are screwing into normally. And then we have the optics down here. And on the optics there's an outer black ring right here, which has two little divots on either side. There's this inner black ring which has four, and that's what's holding on the actual front element right here. But this outer one is holding in the entire front optical group, and that's the one you want access to. It's a little bit tight with the spanning wrench, and if your spanning wrench does not fit there, you can actually remove the black ring, which is what I'll do next. But here I'll just unscrew this. And now I've gone ahead and removed the entire front optical group here. This, like the back element, can be further disassembled with those little four divots up front. You can actually remove the front glass elements and then go in through the front of this and start removing the different elements, cleaning those individually. I'd really only do that if there is some major problem with the lens. If there's just like a tiny amount of dust inside, it's probably not worth it. Now we do have access to both sides of the diaphragm here. Removing the diaphragm itself is pretty easy in this lens as well though. So next up, we'll actually remove this black filter ring holder. It's going around the top section here, just is held in place by three little slotted screws. Another difference between the MC1 and MC2, at least on my copy, is that the MC1 here uses slotted screws almost exclusively, whereas the MC2, I believe, uses kind of a mix of the two. Alright, just lift off that ring. Now we have the next section here, and this is where we're actually going to remove the diaphragm itself. And the diaphragm is held in place by these four little slotted screws going around here. So we're looking down into the focusing ring going around, and then the diaphragm on top. So I'll just undo these four as well. Now I can just take the entire diaphragm piece here and lift it right out. It's completely separate, so it's a nice isolated piece that you can clean pretty much on its own. And looking here at the diaphragm mechanism, you can use this little lever on the back section here to operate it. And it springs closed automatically. And this is actually a pretty good state if you don't have too much oil on the blades here. And this lens would actually probably qualify. You can clean it pretty well in its current state. You can just very carefully, using a Q-tip or something, brush up against here with some isopropyl alcohol and get some of the oil off. Because this lens in particular doesn't have too much oil, it would probably be a good candidate for that. But in this case, I'm actually going to take apart the diaphragm and then reassemble it later. Just to show how that is done as well. And that does allow you to more thoroughly clean the individual diaphragm blades. Looking here at the lens body now, it's just a hollow tube going around here. Going in from the back, we're going to get access to some of the mechanical sections now. So on the back section, you'll notice that there are 8 total screws going around here. They're all little slotted screws. There are 2 sets of screws. There's shorter ones that are just holding on the back plate itself, and then longer ones. So let me get access to 2 of the adjacent screws here. All right, so here is one of the longer screws over. Here's one of the longer screws, and then one of the shorter ones as well. You only want to remove the longer screws going around here, and they alternate. The reason that you only want to remove these longer ones is because that's what's actually holding on the entire back mounting plate. The shorter ones are holding in part of the back mounting plate that has all these like ball bearings and other things in there. So it's a bit of a pain if you actually take that apart, and there's almost no reason to need to take that apart. Usually if there are mechanical problems, it'll be in a different part of the lens. Now I can just lift off the entire back mounting plate. Just looking at this back section here to see what you would be able to remove, the 4 little shorter screws going in here, they'd separate this external silver ring that's kind of not shiny from the internal shiny silver ring here, and then there's all these ball bearings and craziness on the inside here that provide the smooth motion. But if you do take that apart, which you should probably not do, then it's a bit of a pain to put back together, just making sure that all the ball bearings and little spacers line up properly. So now we have access to the back section here with the aperture control ring. And the aperture control ring is just slid in place here, so we can actually remove it right now. There's a little ball bearing in the grooves over here. We have to be careful when removing that, not to lose that. Okay, so there's the little ball bearing right there. Set that aside. We separated the aperture control ring at this stage so it can be cleaned on its own. And the last piece that you can really remove for cleaning the body section here is the focusing ring. So the focusing ring is this ring going around here that you actually grip onto. So right now it's over focused at infinity, which is good. And I'm just going to make a few marks of where things are lining up currently on this focusing ring, because once you remove the focusing ring, you have to line it up again properly. So I'm going to mark the screw that lines up over by this kind of silver guide section right here. I'm just going to mark where it's lining up on the black section. And now we can actually remove the focusing ring. You'll still probably want to zero the lens back to infinity later, but this does provide a little guide. So I'm going to remove the 3 screws going around here. They each have a little washer as well. And the reason you might want to remove the focusing ring is because it allows you to clean the body section externally. These little grooves in here, although they provide a good gripping surface, they tend to build up quite a bit of gunk and other stuff. So that it does allow you to clean it safely without actually affecting the focusing mechanism on the inside here. So we have this piece, which is just the focusing ring, all separate, can be cleaned well. One final body section here, actually. So we have this little bottom section right here, which has the depth of field scale on it. I'm also going to just mark where the little indicator was in a pencil right there. This one, it doesn't have to be zeroed or anything, but there are 4 screw holes, so if you don't attach it correctly, it can be a little bit tricky. So I'm just going to keep it in its current focusing position and undo the 4 little slotted screws going around here. And this will remove the last body section completely from the focusing mechanism, which allows you to really clean this part well. Alright, so just slide this off, get the 4 screws there, and now this is all completely taken apart for the body sections here. So those can all be cleaned very well on their own. Last piece that we're going to take apart now is the diaphragm itself. And the diaphragm, like I mentioned, you only really need to take it apart if there's quite a bit of gunk actually on the blades and you want to clean it well. In this case, the diaphragm is set up much like a lot of the 55 and 50 millimeter Minoltas. It's got this top plate in here that's held in place by 4 set screws going around here, this silver section that's holding in the top plate here. And then the back plate is positioned behind that, and the diaphragm blades are kind of sandwiched in between. So to actually remove the diaphragm blades, I'm going to loosen up the 3 little slotted screws here on the outside, these little tiny ones, then remove the different plates, and then remove the blades. Okay, just slide that plate off. Now there's nothing holding this section in place anymore, so I'm just going to kind of tip it out. Okay, so now I've separated out the blades here, and also separated out this plate section that was on the front. And now there's just this back plate as well. And there we go. So there's the back plate. So we have all these separate now. So these are the different components of the diaphragm, the different 2 top plates, blades, back plate, and then the actual housing. So I'm just going to set these all aside and now clean off the individual diaphragm blades. So cleaning the blades is not too difficult, you just have to be careful. I would recommend not handling them directly or using little tweezers to handle them instead, because your fingerprints will leave more oil on them. I'm going to take all the blades now and just put them into a flat bottom dish with a little bit of isopropyl alcohol in there. These blades are fairly good size too, so they're a little more sturdy and easy to work with than some. And now I'm just going to take each blade here in the dish and very gently just rub the blade and get off the oil, especially on this tip section here where the oil had built up, and clean each one thoroughly individually on both sides. You want to make sure that you're using a flat bottom dish, and you don't want to press too hard on this side over here where the little slot is for things locking together, because then you can potentially warp the blade. But if you're careful, it's not too difficult here. And then after I finish up, I'm just going to remove the blade and set it aside. Just repeat the process with the other. Alright, so that has them all clean. I'll just set them aside to dry. It's a good idea to also clean some of the sections that they're sitting on and they're holding things in place. So the front and back ring here, and then the housing as well, since those tend to have some oil buildup on them. Alright, so now we have the entire lens disassembled here. So I have the optics, all the different body sections like the focusing ring and the mounting plate and the depth of field scale ring, all those separate from the mechanical sections, which is mostly just on the mounting plate back here. It's a pretty simple mechanical setup, especially if you don't take apart the mounting plate and those other 4 screws as well. Separate from the diaphragm over here, so all the diaphragm components. You can see it's not too complicated of a lens, very similar to the MC2 and how it's designed and laid out internally. So now we'll just start on the reassembly. So first up, putting back together the diaphragm. So I'll take the diaphragm here and take the back plate section right here, which is the one with the small metal notch on it on the back. That's going to go backwards, and it's going to go into the little hole right there eventually. But for reassembling the lens, it's easier to do this outside of the lens and then get it all back in place in one piece. So we'll just take each of these blades here and start putting it back together. The diaphragm is a little bit more difficult to reassemble on this lens than on the 1.7 copies of this type of lens, just because the blades are a little bit larger and it's a little harder to work with, but it's still not too bad. So each blade has 2 sections that are important. On this back side over here, the larger side, it has this little slot, and the little slot is going to go onto the little holes on here, or the little posts on here. So that's going to lock on the back side, and then this blade has a little post that should be sticking up, and it sticks up on one side and then it's flat on the other side there. And the little post is going to go into the section here. So what actually happens when how the actual aperture operates here is the top section, this little post, is fixed in place, and then the back plate here rotates around back and forth, and that's actually what controls the diaphragm. So for reassembling this, the easiest way to do this, I find, is to just start going around and get the back sections in place first, and then start reassembling the front section, and get that in place as well. So we'll just start off, put this in place get it into the little slot there, and just kind of nudge it over so it's resting pretty much on the ring there, next to the other post. Next up, grab the next one and just set it right on top of that. And the next 4 or 3, I believe, are all gonna just do the same thing, where they're overlapping and sitting on top of each other. And you can see that this last one I just installed here, it kind of is going past where the other one, the first one, is. So you want to make sure that this one is going under it, and then you can kind of just push it so that it really is going under that first one. And then for the last one, it really has to go underneath the first one. So it's the hardest one to install, but it's going to go on top of this last one and then under the first one. So I'll just start with it out in the middle here, and then slide it out and under this first one. Okay, so that looks good. I'm just going to go around now and make sure that this forms a pretty much a circle going around here. All right, and now I can get the top section here back in place. So it has the 6 little holes that need to get lined up with the posts in here. You can also put this back together in the opposite order, or in the upside down. So you put the top section, you assemble the top section, then put the back section on and lower that in place. But I find this is a little bit easier sometimes. So I'm going to just line up the posts here with the little holes on the top section. Orientation on this does not matter. Okay, and just slide this around a little bit. Okay, got 3 or 4 of them now. There's nothing holding this together at this stage, but you should be able to actually, if you're careful, actually see this opening and closing. So I'm going to leave it open and flip it over now. Now one of the harder parts of reassembling this lens is getting this whole housing back inside. Another thing you can try to do is reassemble this inside of the housing here, but I find that can be a little more challenging to do properly, just because you're more constrained in the space you have to work with. Whereas assembling outside the lens, you have more space to work with when putting back the blades in the correct orientation, but actually getting it back into the housing can be a little bit challenging. So I'm going to take the back section here, being careful not to touch the blades themselves, and I'm going to note where this little, let me get that in focus there, where the little peg right there is. And that peg has to line up with the hole right here on that section. So I'm just going to flip this over and then carefully thread this together. You can see the little hole is right over here, so that kind of provides a guide as well. So just line these 2 up. So you should see the little post protruding through on the back right there, and it should be resting all flat. And if you actually hold this in place and move the back lever, the blade should show up. So let's actually lock this down now, because there's nothing holding this in place. I'm going to take the silver ring here, and with the more sloped side going up, just put this on top. Now take the 3 little set screws and just screw those into place. I'll start off by just getting them into any orientation, and then we'll adjust it later once this is just locked in place, so we don't have to worry about losing all the blades and having to reassemble things again. All right, so I just got this screwed in place. Now you can actually rotate this about, but you'll notice here that what's happening if I move this back and forth, closes up too much actually. So the diaphragm, it's completely closed. It's not letting any light through. So we actually have to adjust this to prevent this from happening, which is not too hard. So the basic problem here is that we reattached the diaphragm, but the top plate is out of position because we kind of just reattached in an arbitrary position here. So you can fix this by, I'm going to loosen up these 3 little screws just slightly. And I'll spin around this until I get the minimum aperture. That looks good. Tighten these back down again. And what you want to look for is that it's not all the way closed when it's at the minimum aperture, and that there are no blades visible when it's at the maximum aperture 1.4 either. So going between these two, it's looking good. So now we'll start reassembling some of the body sections here. First off, the focusing mechanism and the ring here, which had the depth of field scale on it. This is going to go with the back section, with the silver section on the back right here. This intersection with the 8 screws on the back, that's going to go down, and there's this bar on the ring with the depth of field scale right over here. That bar is going to go into the slot right there, and I'll line these 2 up. And if that's properly lined up, then the 4 little screw holes on the back should be lined up there, and we can just reattach these 2 sections. Next up, we'll actually reinstall the diaphragm here, and that will just help guide some of the further reassembly. So on the diaphragm piece here, you'll notice that over on this side, there's, besides being completely round, there's a little flat section right over here. And that flat section is going to line up with the bar that's going up and down here. What that bar does is it locks the inner part of the focusing mechanism in place so that it goes up and down when you focus instead of just spinning around. So this flat section is going to line up with the bar over there. And then the 4 screw holes on the top should line up as well once those 2 are lined up. Okay, and this will just help guide some of the reassembly of the back sections now. So now we're going to reinstall the aperture control ring here. This aperture control ring is just going to slide in place on top of here like this and then get locked in place, but we also have to get the little ball bearing in place. So there are 2 things here. The little ball bearing is going to go in the slot right by the depth of field scale. It's going to go in that little indentation right down there so that it has the grooves resting on top of it. And then to actually control the aperture, to couple the aperture control ring into the diaphragm, this piece here, the aperture control ring, has this little metal fork right here. That's going to go onto the lever right over here. And it's going to adjust the minimum aperture. So I'll get these lined up. So to get these in place, first off I'll take the ball bearing here and just put it in its position in that pocket right there. Then I'll kind of line up this other metal fork piece with the section it needs to go into. Kind of just slide this entire ring over on top of where the ball bearing is. And if you're having trouble doing this all in one step, you can also remove the little fork section here, get the ball bearing in place first with the ring, then reattach the little fork section. What this also allows you to do is if you don't like how the aperture is opening and closing slightly here, and you want to make just a fine adjustment, because the 2 little slots here that the fork piece is going into over here, they're a little bit longer and pill-shaped. You can actually adjust how this falls in here and make slight adjustments, which is useful, and you don't always have to actually go and readjust the aperture if it's not opening and closing properly. Now this looks pretty good. So we'll get on the back optic here as well. This will be easier to do at this stage. So this just screws in place on the back section. And I'll lock it down using the spanning wrench here. Now just to finish up the back reassembly, I'm going to reinstall the mounting plate section here. So the mounting plate has to get coupled in so that the stop down lever on the back actually is hooking in properly. You'll notice that on the body section here, this lever right here is the stop down lever. So actually let me go close close this up. So that is the lever that's controlling things. On the back section here, the stop down lever on the outside, it's controlling this intersection right here, this kind of black section. And it has this little post that's sticking up. That's what's going to go in front of this lever and actually open and close the diaphragm. Like this, and then the 4 screw holes should also line up on the back section as well. So that when you hit the lever over there, opens and closes the diaphragm. So now we have just the front section of the lens to reassemble here. And we're going to do it in a slightly different order because I'm actually going to show how to zero the lens as well. So first off, just going to reinstall the front optic. So the front optic just screws in place like this. Then we can lock it down using a spanning wrench in the 2 outermost divots. And the reason for reinstalling the front optic is that now we have the entire lens optically reassembled at this point. So you can actually see, it can focus in and out here. But we don't have the focusing ring attached. And the reason is because we removed the focusing ring, once you do that, there's no definite position that it has to be locked down into. So the focusing ring, to properly reattach it, you really should go and zero the lens back to infinity. The way that's achieved is you go take the lens outside somewhere and you actually go and focus on something very far away and adjust the lens so that it's optically focused at infinity. So I'd go out and find, oh, that maybe this is optically, it's focused at infinity right here. And once I find where it's optically focused at infinity, I'd put back on this focusing ring here and just spin this around so that it's pointing to infinity as well and lock it down in that position. Before I kind of made a little mark right over on one of the screw holes right there to help just with the realignment. So this is actually pretty close to that, and for just this demonstration, I'm not actually going to go and optically focus it back to infinity, but that is what you should normally do. So I'm going to assume that right now it's optically focused in infinity, looks good, and now I'll just take the focusing ring here, make sure that it's pointing to infinity as well, and then reattach the 3 little screws with the little washers as well. You want to make sure that you can rotate between the entire range of the focusing distance here. So 0.6 meters to infinity, and that kind of snaps it at both ends too. And now finally, just had to reattach a few more pieces here. So we got the ring here that the filters screw into with the 3 little screws. They're going to go down into this piece right here on the outer ring. But it's easier, I find, to reinstall the screws first and then just tighten them down. So I'm going to get the 3 screws in place on this ring first. And now this can just go into position. I'll line up the 3 screw holes and tighten this piece down as well. And finally, to finish off the reassembly, just getting the name ring back in place. It just kind of screws down in place here. And I'll use the spanning wrench to actually lock this down all the way. Alright, so that has the lens pretty much completely reassembled. You can make sure that everything is operating properly, that aperture is adjusting properly here. Stop down lever works, and you can see that it's much more snappy now, which is good. So we cleaned off the oil well, and that the focusing works properly, and that when you actually mount this on a camera, it is focusing properly to infinity as well. Overall, this lens is very, very similar to the MC2, so if you've taken apart one, it's very easy to take apart the other. It's a little bit more difficult just for a few very minor reasons, like the slotted screws, I would say, but the internal layout is almost identical. And it's a very repairable lens. There aren't too many components. All the components are fairly large. They're all metal, so if there are any problems with the lens, mechanical, optical, you can really get access to all the components and take it apart and really service the lens yourself. So I would say overall, it's a very repairable and easy to service lens.